There are things a book can do that a missionary cannot. A book can find its way into the inner chambers of a mosque or palace or harem. It is available at any moment of leisure and can speak without a foreign accent. It can present facts without personal antagonism and develop a theme without interruption. It suffers no sickness or fatigue and enjoys a lifespan much longer than its author's 70 years and 10.
All the way from Bokota village in Limpopo, South Africa, we bring you Missionary Minds, where you can learn about family, church history, biblical worldview issues, and of course, missions, all from the mind of a real-world missionary of almost 20 years. And Brother Paul, today, we want to address the question, how does one make a lasting impact in ministry? And this is dealing with really what people want to achieve, a legacy or an impact that outlives them. And we're going to be discussing writing and a couple of other things, but I want to leave it at that. How does one make a lasting impact in ministry? Over to you, Mfundisi.
Well, this comes from the story of Anthony Norris Groves, who was one of the great missionaries of the 19th century, although not perhaps as well known as some of the great missionaries of that century, that great century of missions like David Livingstone or Adoniram Judson or Hudson Taylor. He was indeed a great missionary, and one of the ways that he was so influential was through his writing. And so we want to talk about that a little bit today, about the encouragement for missionaries to write. And this is even knowing that Norris Groves was not necessarily a gifted writer. He was not a man who set aside large amounts of time to pen pages. In fact, the book that he is known for, which is called Christian Devotedness, is just really almost like a booklet. You might even call it a tract. And he wrote it about a year after his conversion. So he's still back in England. He is a trained dentist. He's a surgeon. That's basically his day job. But he was very concerned about the love of money that he saw, not only in his society, but also in the churches. And he saw that very much as a deterrent to missions. And so he basically went through Scripture and tried to pull out a philosophy of money. And that book became very influential. It became influential on his brother-in-law, George Mueller, who was, of course, more popular in church history. And George Mueller became known as a man who never asked for money. He would live by faith, and he would care for thousands of orphans. And he would look back at that book, Christian Devotedness, as kind of a second conversion for him, a turning point for him. And I was a little doubtful about this because, the book that I read, Father of Faith Missions by Robert Dan, he later on says that the book or the booklet that Groves wrote might have been the most influential, long-lasting impact that Groves ever had. And he said it was one of the most influential books in the 19th century. And I thought, come on, this can't be true. He's overstating this. This is his guy he's writing a biography about, so he has to say something like that. I mean, I had never even heard the book before I read this biography, and the biography is not even a popular book. So what do? Like all people in 2024, I Googled it, and sure enough, I think there's some kind of Wikipedia page where it says the most influential Christian books of the 19th century. And one of the books on there was Christian Devotedness. I was very surprised. And you can get the PDF for free online. And I just thought that was really insightful, that here's a man who gave so much to the mission field. And I'm not discounting all of the necessity of church planting and prayers and discipleship and all of that. But you could make the point, and that's the point that Dan makes, that it really was his writings that went on and became one of the most influential parts of his ministry.
Exactly, brother. And even as we think of other wonderful men in church history. One of the most famous books alongside the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress. It's a writing that has, in some senses, made the man famous, not the man making the writing famous. And that writing has outlived John Bunyan multiple times over. And with many other books by many other men, if you think of Jonathan Edwards or others, their writings are constantly outliving them. And so,
and speaking of John Bunyan, I mean, even yesterday I was preaching from Romans 9, and we covered a very difficult doctrine of reprobation. And, one of the arguments kind of about reprobation is that it kills evangelism. That's the argument made about election. For those who don't know, reprobation is the flip side of election. So God sovereignly chooses some to spend eternity with him in heaven, and God sovereignly damns others to spend eternity in hell. That would be reprobation. And the key, there's many passages that teach this. The key passage would be Romans 9. And sure enough, here's John Bunyan, one of my heroes. In fact, he's written my most favorite book, and that is Pilgrim's Progress. What he's lesser known for, but still helpful to me, 2024, these centuries later, and as I'm studying for this sermon, I'm helped by the words of John Bunyan, who wrote the book Reprobation Affirmed. And so he wrote a whole book on this doctrine of reprobation, even though Calvin calls it a horrible doctrine in the sense of a terrible doctrine. It's a true doctrine, it comes from Scripture, but this terrifying doctrine, and yet Bunyan says, yeah, it might be terrifying, but I'm going to give a whole book to this because Scripture teaches it. And so here we are centuries later, just as a parenthesis, as you mentioned, John Bunyan. I think that's a great example of someone whose life centuries later is still helping people like me in Bokota Village in 2024, and it's because of his writings.
Yes. And there's actually a quote that the author Dan writes as he's speaking about this impact of writing. Could you read that out for us, or I don't know if you recall it?
Yes, it's so let me read it for you. It's from the chapter called That Burly Saxon Figure. And let me just kind of set up the audience a little bit about why it's called The Burly Saxon Figure. It's a chapter on a guy named Karl Pfander, who was a German who comes to Baghdad to become a missionary, and he was just incredibly gifted, and he was known to be given to apologetics. And so he was excellent with languages, and he had debates with Muslim scholars, and even the book that he wrote, which was a Christian defense against Islam, is still in print and read today. And in light of that, it was talking about the importance of the writing that he had given. So this quote is not specifically about Groves, even though Groves, it could fit for Groves because his book was so influential, Christian Devotedness. But this is what Dan says about writing, specifically about that burly Saxon figure who was Pfander, but it could be applied to Groves as well. And this is what he says, quote, "There are things a book can do that a missionary cannot. A book can find its way into the inner chambers of a mosque or palace or harem. It is available at any moment of leisure and can speak without a foreign accent. It can present facts without personal antagonism and develop a theme without interruption. It suffers no sickness or fatigue and enjoys a lifespan much longer than its author's 70 years and 10. I mean, that's what a beautiful paragraph. And again, if we knew the background to this, it really would flesh out the greatness of this quote, because Pfander is in this debate and he gets crushed. Well, it's not because he didn't know his material. He miscalculated. And this is note to self, because I've had public debates before with Muslims, and I can remember how challenging it was. It was just on on one specific topic. It was in English. It was with a Muslim apologete. And it was specifically not just on the deity of Christ, but it was, did Jesus himself say, essentially in the Gospels, did Jesus himself say that he was God? And I remember, even though it was so narrow and in English, just the challenge and the time it took. Well, here's Fander. Now imagine this. This is centuries ago, and it's not in his own language. It's in a foreign language. And they said, let's choose 5 topics for this debate. And he overcompensated, and it was too broad of a topic, and he was given a sidekick, a helper that was not helpful at all. And in the end, it was all over the newspapers, and he was slammed. And he had written this book that was kind of left behind, and he left discouraged. And it was that book that led multiple men to Christ. It was the kind of thing where it was kind of left behind, and one of the Muslims kind of put it in his bookshelf, and he left it for years. And then later on, he's cleaning out his bookshelf. He grabs the book, he starts reading it, and long story short, he comes to Christ. I mean, that's a perfect example of how it was the writings of Fander, and by extension, Groves, that had such a long-lasting impact in the Christian world.
I was listening a couple of weeks ago to one of Bodhisattva's lectures, and he was discussing something, and he said that I would hope that if my opponents were here, they would say, although I disagree with you, you fairly represented me. And that's something that I enjoy watching debates, but sometimes even Christians can be guilty of interrupting and speaking over or making fallacious arguments, straw man arguments. And with this quote here saying that it can present facts without personal antagonism and develop a theme without interruption, that's something that books and writings are able to do. There's a context, there's thought, everything poured in.
And some of the advantages of speaking in person. I mean, there's things books can't do because it can't communicate tone, right? But there are other things they can do. I'm even thinking of James White, who said, similar to what you just mentioned, I would hope that if I was giving a debate and my opponent was somehow didn't show up to the debate, that I could present his argument better than he could. That kind of idea. And yet even watching James White, because there's some channels out there where they will watch debates and then analyze the debates. I've been watching this one by a former pastor, and he's like, he formerly taught debate, and so he's interacting with these. And he's even pointed out, even James White, who's such an excellent debater, he's saying, James White shouldn't have said that, or notice his facial expressions, or why did you have to cringe? You know, when that's a really good point. When you hand someone a book, it's like the pressure's off in a sense. You can read it at your leisure at whatever time you want to, and that's really one of the benefits. The book he wrote was called Mizan ul Haq, and it is still being read today and had a long-lasting impact in the Christian world.
Yes, brother. I have a couple of practical questions to get into. Do you have anything else on Norris Groves before I do?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is, many pastors, and even particularly in the African context, or I should say more so in the African context, are not familiar with the practice of writing. It seems that maybe only recently are more African Christian authors pumping out content. You think of Conrad Mbewe and others. And so where does someone begin? How does someone even start with this?
One of the men that's had a great influence on me, Gary North, who's passed away now, but he was asked if you could give your young self, if you could give counsel to yourself 30 years ago, what would it be in 3 words or 2 words or something like that? It was something short. And he said, write every day. That would be my counsel. That's North speaking. Write every day. And I think he said something. He's also an economist, so he said something funny like, put your stocks in this company or something, like 30 years ago, you get the benefit of foresight. But after the laugh, after the joke, it was something like write every day. And I think that's true. Now, we don't journal anymore today. Everyone in the past, they would write every day, write down in their journal, and most people don't do that today. But we have blogs and websites and even our own podcast. We pull from men who write for the African Review in 5. We pull from about a dozen guys, and some of them are published authors who write for it, but some of them haven't published anything. And I think this is a great kind of introduction for them to learn how to write, have something published. It's going to be out there. You're going to have to stand by it. So make sure that you do an excellent job. I would say write every day as much as you can. And I think that's going to make you a better writer. And I think of someone like Douglas Wilson, who is just such an excellent writer and communicator. And I've looked at some of his books now he's in his early 70s now. I think he was born in 1953, so he's 71. And I don't think he even published his first book until he was something around 40, which is pretty late for a prolific author. And when you read some of those early books, this is coming from a Doug Wilson fan, they were bad. They were poorly written. And when I read them, I was actually encouraged because I thought, here's a prolific author who doesn't just write a lot of books, but he's known for just being a wordsmith. He's known for being able to turn a phrase well. And in his 40s, when I read his material, I thought, this is bad. So let that be an encouragement to you. Right now, if you're a pastor, you should already be under the discipline of writing out your sermons. Now, I'm not saying take your manuscript into the pulpit. I know that R.C. Sproul preached without notes, but of course, he turned those notes into books. So it's not as though he hadn't studied. He was studying immensely and putting it all into print, writing it out longhand, and then those became books. But they went into the pulpit. He didn't take any notes with him. So I would encourage you as a pastor, make sure you're writing it out carefully so that hopefully in the future that can be turned into some kind of published work. But even if it's not, just get in the discipline of what North said, write every day.
It makes me think of someone who walks to the entrance of a gym every day and they want to get in shape and they're like, where do I start? Well, start somewhere, get inside and start. The best time to start was yesterday, in a sense. And just putting in those 10,000 hours. I was on the drive back from Joburg yesterday. I was listening to a podcast by G3 on Spurgeon, Charles Spurgeon. And they said that if you work out how many books he wrote and you kind of sum them up in his adult life, he was about putting out a book every 4 months. That's what it would have equated to. And just like his preaching, he said his first sermons were bad, but then he got better with time. And so the same way with anything, you start somewhere and then you get better with time.
Stephen King, this is going to be the only Stephen King illustration you'll ever get in our podcast. But Stephen King is he's like this horror author that's known worldwide. But in his early books, he used a pen name. And he was asked why he used the pen name, and it was because it was considered that if you publish more than one book a year, it was not feasible. So he was publishing more than one book a year. Now you might say he should have been publishing 0 books a year, but be that as it may, he was publishing more than one book a year. So he had to use Stephen King for one book, and then he had to use a fake name for another book because he was writing so much. And now he's become this prolific author, and part of it was because he was just constantly writing. But I must say though, if you're going to constantly write, that's output. Another way to answer your question is there's going to have to be a ton of input, and that means you're going to have to read constantly. You cannot give what you don't have. So think of yourself as this reservoir, and every time you're writing, you're opening up the tap, the faucet that comes out. But also think that reservoir when it has water in it, the tap's going in, and every time that you do you use your time for foolish things, it's like you're turning that tap off, and the water cannot feed that reservoir that eventually is going to have to feed out to whatever you're writing. So make sure that you're constantly reading, having books constantly in your library and on your bookshelf, so that you can be feeding yourself, so eventually you can give out things in your writings.
That's very helpful, brother. Could you make a comment on something I've seen you practice and something that could be helpful for other pastors to practice, making your efforts work twice? And a quick apology to the listeners. That's a lorry in the background, so please.
Oh, this is real life. I would say Joel Beakey told me that one time at a meal at his house some time ago. I have tremendous respect for him. Now, he's someone who's written probably 100 books, and he's constantly putting out excellent material, primarily about the Puritans. And he said his goal is to just make everything work twice. So if he writes a sermon, it should be the type of thing that can go into print. And I think that's one reason why his sermons are so warm, because it's not easy to put, this doctrinally heavy sermon in a book that's going to really inspire people. So his writings are very warm and experiential, is what he would say. I was in his study, actually, and it was a sight to behold. I mean, there were stacks of paper all around just paper everywhere. And he said every few months he has ladies who will come into his study and just organize, because he's just a machine, and he's just writing so much and he's reading so much that with all these papers, and people are probably always asking him to recommend their books and endorse their books and write for this journal and write for this book, that he's just got so much material that there's papers everywhere, and he had to have people specifically set aside. But whatever he does, he tries to make it, even if he's speaking at a funeral, or even if he's supposed to address the kids at a school, how can I use whatever I'm going to say work twice? I think Doug Wilson's a great example of that. I even think about one of the other benefits of writing, and not just making things work twice, but just the doors that writing will open for you. I know for myself that I'm this little missionary in a little village in a little corner of South Africa, and unknown. But whatever opportunities I have had, I would say those have really been intensified because of writing. And I'm thinking specifically the biography of John Payton has really snowballed to the point that I've met a lot of people that I know specifically, whether it's sponsors for our ministry or opportunities to preach at places, or inroads into missions organizations or schools or seminaries. Many of these have come about simply by that book. That book has gone to the other side of the world. I get emails or notes all the time of, hey, I was at this person's house in Sweden and I saw your book on their bookshelf, or so-and-so that I never would have met on the other side of the country, and say, oh, come speak for us because of, we heard about or come speak at our on our podcast because of this book. And so that's another benefit that writing does. It really will open up doors. And I'm even thinking about someone like you, Carney, because you're the voice of Missionary Minds and the African Review in 5, and what that does, it's gonna open up doors for you. It's gonna give you opportunities to meet people, and then hopefully it will allow you more opportunities to give your story and spread the message of Jesus Christ around the world. And that came about because of writing.
Amen, brother. And as we close off here, do you mind just giving a couple of examples of things you've worked on or things you work on with regards to your writing, whether it's books or blogging or whatever else it might be, and the frequency of your writing?
Well, I would say the first place, Between Two Cultures, is our website, and we probably put out, on average, I'd say maybe 4 articles a day or a week. So I think that's pretty good. Typically on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we put out an Africa Review in 5, which is just kind of a cultural adaptation of the current events happening in our world from a Christian perspective. And then on Mondays, we normally address something on missions. On Friday, we normally address something on family. And then Wednesday, if I have the time, I'll put out a book review. I like reviewing books and then even summarizing the book, which would be more specific. Sometimes I'll address a biblical supposed contradiction. I have a document on my computer called The 12, and that is 12 manuscripts, 12 books, essentially, that I'm working on, anywhere from family worship to books on marriage to biographies. So I always have things that I'm working on, whether it's a commentary or whatever. So yeah, I have a lot of projects that I'm trying to work on because I want to, even though I don't see myself at all as a skilled writer, I know that if I write a lot, I'll at least improve. So I'm not saying I'll improve from a 7 to a 9, but maybe I'll improve from a 2 to a 3. And if I do improve from a 2 to a 3 because I'm writing, I'll take that because it's progress and I want to get better.
Yes, I hope that's an inspiration to many others listening to this podcast. What a treat, Mfundisi. To our audience, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to rate it and subscribe to keep posted with more upcoming content. Feel free to share this episode with someone who might find it interesting and submit any questions you may want answered in a future podcast. You can email those questions to paulslayline@gmail.com. You can also visit betweentwocultures.com for other resources like this. I'm your host, Jamikani Katunga, and until next time, that's it from Missionary Minds.